So nice to see everybody here. And I would like to specifically thank the organizers of Develop for giving us a slot that was not the 10 a.m. slot. So most of you are here and are fully awake. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chris Phillip, and I'm going to be chairing this panel. And before we start, I just wanted to ask you all to raise your hand if you have ever received any sort of grant or public support for your company. Cool, that's about half of you. I'm really happy to hear that. And I'm joined here today by three great panelists. Each of you also run some sort of fund or public support program, in some cases both. And I also work as a fund manager for the UK Global Screen Fund, which is a DCMS fund that's run by the BFI. This morning, I had a really interesting discussion with somebody who I don't know if they're in the room, specifically about how in the games industry, we are working within this dichotomy where we publicly keep talking about how it's an amazing industry. We have amazing sales. The industry as a whole is worth more than the film industry and the music industry combined. Yet at the same time, we need to keep reminding people that that's not always the case for the independent UK game developers who are sometimes struggling to make ends meet when it comes to project financing or to understanding how to grow their company into a scale up, which I think is one of those problems that's happening across the screen industries. So I'm going to hand over to the other panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a bit more about what they do. And then I'll tell you more about the UK Global Screen Fund as well, I promise. Rory?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, folks. My name's Rory Clifford. I am the Interactive Manager at Northern Ireland Screen. We are the national screen agency for Northern Ireland. We support the film, TV, animation, documentary, children's sectors, but I specifically look after interactive, which is video games, immersive, and then whatever else that falls in that they don't understand, they chuck it my way as well. But we run a screen fund, so we primarily do a lot of stuff around prototyping. So we have a prototype fund and we do production funding. And alongside that, I run the Pixmill, which is our co-working space in Belfast for the video games industry. It's a co-working space first, but also we have business programs for new studios and also a bunch of stuff around skills and education as well.
Hi, I'm Sarah from Creative UK. So I am currently the project manager of a program that we run called Creative Enterprise, which is a national business support program for the screen industry. So we cover film, TV, gaming, creator, interactive. Within the wider Creative UK, we have various other funds and support programs. We have the regional support programs, specifically the CGP programs, which we have one for Southeast, one for Southwest, and one for Northeast. We have our Create Growth Finance Fund, which is a debt investment fund of, I think, the last round that they give 20 million away. Within Creative Enterprise that I run, we do lots of business support programs, grants. Previously, we've done New Ideas Fund grants, which is a research and development grant of up to 25,000. We do business support grants of up to 5,000 for you to work one-on-one with a consultant to get really underneath the roots of your business. And then in the wider Creative UK, we do policy, we do production services. So yeah, we cover pretty much everything, but I do the business support on Creative Enterprise.
Hi, I'm Paul Durrant, and I'm the founder of UK Games Talent and Finance Community Interest Company. Rather a long title, but it describes essentially what we do in terms of supporting the UK's early stage independent game sector. And that's essentially our legal remit as a community interest company to support that sector as a community of interest and those individuals who work with or aspire to work within it. We run two key programs, the first of which and the most well-known is the UK Games Fund, which provides prototype grants normally of around £25,000 for content development, for the grant to be used for salary and contractor costs generally for prototype development. We also run Transfuser, a graduate enterprise talent program, which takes immediate graduates and puts them through a summer program, allowing them to pitch to us at the end of it. And linked to that, we also have a new residential program called Undev, where we take 4 teams who haven't made it through Transfuser, but we work with them intensively over the month of January in the sunny city of Dundee. And then they pitch to us at the end of that residential period for a UK Games Fund grant.
Yeah, and in terms of the Global Screen Fund, I believe that it is the youngest program out of all of the ones here. It was set up 2 years ago by DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, with the intention of helping companies that are working in the screen industries to expand internationally and to really grow their business within a global setting. So within that, we have a total fund size of £7 million per year, out of which 2 of the strands are focused on international co-production for film and TV, international sales and distribution for film, and that has 3 separate strands. And one of the strands, the international business development strand, which is the strand that I manage, is open to all of the screen industries, including interactive narrative video games. So it's going to be film, TV, animation, sales, distributors, and video game developers. And I think that throughout all of it, so international business development has 1 round per year, and that's about £2 million per year, more or less. And so far, in the 2 rounds that have closed and we have announced our awardees, we have funded 13 games companies, some of which are in the room with us today. So hi everyone! If we have supported you, it's really nice to have you here. And I think that's part of what I wanted to talk about. So throughout our introductions, you have heard some words that maybe don't necessarily feel at home within the games industry. The 2 of us have talked about the screen industries. We have talked about Transfuser. We have talked about content and generally like games as content. And quite often, what this is going to create is the need to demystify, which is why we put this panel together to try and answer some of the questions that people might have. And I think a big part of that has to do with how the funds themselves are created and how we ourselves get the money that we then distribute to the companies who we work with, either through direct interventions such as grant funding or through business support and consultancy programs. So Rory, do you want to start? Because I think your program is the most geographically bound one.
Yeah, so the clue's in the name, Northern Ireland Screen. So all of our funding is focused on the screen industries in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland Screen was like a film office 25 years ago, and then as time has gone on, has developed, we became part of the Department for Economy in Northern Ireland. So we're technically an economic development agency, but we still have a wide remit around skills, content, education and culture. So allows us a lot of leeway in terms of what we fund. Our funding, like the prototype funding, primarily there's 3 tiers. We fund anything from 30 grand up to 100 grand. We have a lot of flexibility in terms of we fund projects that are in Northern Ireland, or if there's co-development or co-production opportunities, we've co-funded projects which have a Northern Irish element, be it like a development team based in Northern Ireland. It may be an IP that's owned by a different studio, or an IP that's been developed by a Northern Irish studio and a studio somewhere else in the world. So we do a lot of co-development. We also have our startup programs, our business programs. We have mini game. Well, first of all, we're a hub for Transfuser, so any kind of Northern Irish studios or student teams who may be based on other parts of the UK who are moving back home. The Pix Mill acts as the hub for that there. We also have mini game, which is a first game program. So we take brand new teams who've never made a game before. We give them 25 grand, 5 months, just to make a short, concise game and get it out there into the wild and see how it goes. And then we have Platform, which is a 12-month program, which is about 60 grand. And again, the goal is to develop a game, ideally to self-publish, but if something else happens along the way that helps take it in a different direction, that's grand. But we take the teams to the Gamescom, we fully fund that, and we bring in a bunch of mentors and workshops as well. So a lot of our stuff, our structures were originally around the film and TV world, but as we've evolved as an organization, we've understand the foibles that's in game development, the requirements around prototyping, the kind of pressures put on dev studios when they're pitching to publishers, and the expectations of the quality of the prototypes that they have to have. So we've changed our structure in terms of level of funding and what we expect from studios a lot, considering what is expected of game devs when they're speaking to publishers.
And I think an interesting thing about your grants is that they tend to lend themselves quite well to what we could call a co-production or co-development, where the grant itself needs to go to a company that's registered in Northern Ireland, I believe, and also needs to be used in Northern Ireland. So the costs themselves need to be happening in Northern Ireland.
But there is an advantage to that. So, for example, we do a co-development project every year with the Canadian Media Fund, CMF. So what will happen is we try to matchmake, and so we bring like Canadian studios across film, TV, animation, and video games, and we introduce them to our talent in Northern Ireland. And if there's a natural fit, then what will happen is the CMF will fund the Canadian part, will fund the Northern Irish part, as long as they're working towards a single IP. Or equally, if someone's going to the UK Games Fund and they get a bit of funding from UK Games Fund, we can match fund against it. And then equally, if they go to Global Screen Fund and they get a bit of funding from Global Screen Fund, we can match fund against it. So we try to be as flexible as we can. We're always keen to see other funders in a project because it kind of helps show the commercial viability of the project. But yeah, we're pretty much open and flexible. Like if there's a good project there's a solid Northern Irish component. We try to do as much as we can to make it happen.
Thanks. And then Sarah, I think from the Creative UK side, you're trying to, you have multiple programs that you've mentioned. So you mentioned CGP, which stands for Create Growth Program, which is, I believe, part of the Leveling Up promise. And that is part of funding that comes from DCMS. And you've also mentioned Creative Enterprise, which is National Lottery BFI funded, right? So how do those work in terms of like restrictions and what they can and can't do?
So Creative Enterprise that I work on, it directly funded through the BFI National Lottery. And this fund was created to address some business skills that were lacking in the industry. So going along the theory of right brain, left brain, there's some amazingly creative people out there, but sometimes I need help with business support, the things that are not necessarily creative. So your financial planning, your market analysis, your investment pitch decks, which I'm sure there's a lot of creatives in the room, they might not drive what gets you out of bed in the morning, but they're just as equally important when running a business. So Creative Enterprise helps with that side of things. So we do foundations programs for early stage startups. We do our scale up programs. We have our female founders program and our game scale up or screen scale up programs, which is for a mid-level business, all the way through to Evolve, which is our investment readiness program. And so all of our funds and programs that we do, they're primarily for business growth. So we can't fund any content production. We did have our New Ideas Fund, which was like a research and development grant. But again, that grant is there just to diversify your revenue streams into your business. And so what I think is really important when looking for grants out there, these grant bodies that provide the grants will usually have one of three outcomes. They either want to grow your business, they either want innovation, or they want impact for a social group or a cause. So it's about finding the right grant that fits you. Not looking for a grant to fit you, but you to fit the grant that way. So within Creative Enterprise, it's primarily for business support, growth, diversifying revenue streams, increasing turnover, increasing your team.
And then with CGP?
So CGP, our Create Growth Program in the Southeast, Southwest and Northeast, that's an investment-ready program for scale-up level companies. So it's introductions to investors, it's getting your pitch deck ready, it's learning the language of investors, because sometimes it can seem like a complete new language when you're going to these pitch events, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So it's just getting used to that language that investors use.
And then I think, Paul, you have the most, much like the UK Global Screen Fund, your fund is open UK-wide. However, sometimes depending on the round, I think you also had some restrictions in terms of who could apply, like the type of company or the type of games that you could support, right?
Yes, we certainly fund across the UK, and we don't have any regional bias, other than trying to make sure that we do have a reasonable spread of funding across the UK. I'm primarily going to speak about the UK Games Fund because I think that's the main thing of interest to this audience. And as I said earlier, our funding is for supporting content development, particularly at a kind of prototyping stage of around £25,000. And our funding is essentially for staff and contractor costs in undertaking that project. We try and keep it as simple as we can. We are funded by DCMS, and what we try and do is to make sure that our sort of forward-facing aspect of, securing applications from potential grantees is relatively simple. But because the nature of the funding that we have relates to creating economic impact, it does mean that sometimes you'll find when you apply to us, and I'm saying this under the kind of heading of demystification, that we might be more focused on early stage growth and economic impact in a way that doesn't seem to sort of work very well with your kind of immediate ambitions and aims to get a really interesting and creative project out of the door. And so what we're trying to do is to make our criteria and conditions work, but in a way that can also support you to at least have some content funding on relatively soft terms.
Yeah, and in terms of the international business development strand, which I mentioned, this also is coming from DCMS directly. So Sarah mentioned the Creative Enterprise Program, which is funded through the National Lottery. When you're looking at the impact that we're making, very much like what Paul mentioned, we are also looking at economic outputs. And over 3 years, in the case of international business development, we are looking at seeing your business grow from a business that has some sustainability. They should have at least one game that is released, for example, or in the case of film and TV, one title that is released. And we are looking at you increasing your international turnover over the course of 3 years. The funding itself through the international business development strand isn't meant to fund prototypes, because that is the remit of the UK Games Fund. It's meant to help your entire company. It's meant to help your entire company and your growth strategy over 3 years. And I think this is just a very small part about the information that we have in terms of how we understand our remit and how we need to then translate that and make that accessible to you, because we sometimes, like each of us, I think at some point has held at least a 1-hour webinar about our funds and how to apply to them. And I highly encourage you to join those, because the way that the funding is funneled from central government or devolved administrations into the bodies we work with, and then to you, sometimes means that we need to be the bridge and translate quite a few of their requirements into business-focused language that you will then understand and make that accessible. And that isn't always the easiest feat to achieve, and we are still always learning, but we're constantly trying to make things achievable. I think it would be great to here also mention, acknowledge and thank the regional and development administration partners we are all working with and have worked with at one point or another. So for example, I remember with Creative UK, sometimes you worked with Games London in order to make applications accessible to companies that are based in London, or with companies or with other bodies like Northern Ireland Screen. I know for certain that we work quite closely in the Global Screen Fund, both with Northern Ireland Screen, but also with Creative Scotland and with Creative Wales. And we always try to listen to our regional and national stakeholders, as well as industry stakeholders as well. So when we are looking at accessibility and the importance of applying, the importance of actually joining the information sessions, how do you take feedback from industry and then translate that either back to the stakeholders like government, like the BFI, and why is it important for people to speak up if, for example, we use language that is a bit too formal or things like that?
I think the main feedback we get from students we work with is actually with taking public funding, there's usually a lot of paperwork involved in terms of vouching and applications, and that's a lot of the feedback we would get is like, let's try and smooth this out or make it a more streamlined process. So that's a lot of the focus we take is like, just try and make this as easy as possible. Most of the independent studios are living month to month, so like if a application process is going to take 3, 4, 5, 6 months, then that's no use to someone who has an immediate needs. So trying to streamline our processes, and also the vouching side of things when we're asking just for proof that money's been spent and stuff, like make that process relatively painless. So that's where a lot of the feedback we get. A lot of the drive for like our current drive and our funding at the moment is driven by our Department for Economy, where the real focus is on 3 strands, which is innovation, inclusion, and sustainability. So when we're looking at applications, it's through that lens. So is the project innovative in its own space? Is the team working in a sustainable way? And is the team diverse? That's becoming a big part of our assessment of projects, both in terms of company leadership, but also like team leads or even freelancers that they're bringing in. So that's where a lot of our kind of focus is at the moment. And that's like what's influencing a lot when we're looking at applications.
Yeah, same really. So, I mean, we're always open for feedback, especially on like the application procedure and everything like that. Last year, we opened up applications, like video applications, and then we got some feedback and said it'd be great if we could just do like audio applications. So that's something that we're looking to feedback this year. And as Chris mentioned earlier, it's really like, I know we all do, is we have like webinars beforehand where you can speak to us one-on-one, ask any questions before you put the application in, because it's so like saddening for me when I go through all these applications and it's just one massive, like they're just not eligible, but I can see how much time and effort they've put in this application, but they've just missed one thing off the criteria or something like that. So really, really important. If you've got any questions at all about eligibility, drop the fund a line, drop them an email. They'd always answer any questions for you. Like, for example, with our previous iterations of Creative Enterprise, we couldn't directly support companies based in London. But then it's like, well, what is London? Where are the boundaries of London? Are you going on inside the M25? Are you going on parliamentary counties? Are you going on national? Yeah, so if there's any sort of vagueness and you're like, I'm not too sure if I'm eligible, then the fund managers, that's their job, just to help you apply. So please do drop them an email.
For us, and this harks back to one of Chris's points earlier, because we try and have a bit of a portfolio balance between solo devs and immediate startups and companies that are a little bit further along the route, we do shift our application criteria slightly from time to time. And we've experimented over the last 10 or 12 rounds really with trying to make that a reasonably user-friendly process. But, of necessity, partly because of, the way we account for how we consider applications, there's still a fair amount of work in putting an application to us together, in terms of a written application and a pitch video. What we've tried to do is to make sure there's good guidance for our pitch videos, almost to the point where sometimes I've asked myself, have we helped everyone so much that all the pitch videos look the same now? And it becomes difficult to differentiate between them if the more that you set out a kind of template approach and try and support people with that. For anybody who's trying to stand above the crowd in an application, it can become more challenging. So I think you have to be careful with that. We have tried and experimented with expressions of interest, because we have found, particularly for our rounds that have pretty much no strings attached, that we can have a huge volume of applications that becomes very difficult to manage. And so we've started to use a kind of expression of interest route where we kind of quickly screen initial expressions of interest and try and go back to people early and say, look, you're just not going to fit with what we're looking for here. So don't waste your time putting in an application. And we've particularly done that where we've tended towards looking for more experienced companies in certain rounds. And we wanted to make sure that someone who's coming to us afresh isn't trying to get into that round and making sort of claims about the level of experience that they've had that'll only become clear as we assess the application as being something that doesn't really stand up to close scrutiny. So essentially, we're trying as best we can to match our requirements to a reasonably low amount of work on behalf of the applicant. But when we come to questions later, I'd happily take any criticism from anyone who's out there in the audience who says, "Oh no, you're not."
Yeah, I think from my end, you will find that throughout all of the funding bodies, as well as all of the applications for application forms, we always keep iterating. I know that's definitely like the case with all of us. I have seen how the first rounds of the UK Games Fund look like in terms of application form, and we're always trying to become more accessible, update the language, and make sure that everybody understands it and everybody can apply. And especially from my end, it's very interesting when you're managing a fund that is meant for all of the screen industries, and you need to use a language that can be understood by the games industry, at the same time by the film industry, at the same time by the TV industry, because everybody will use different sometimes the same word for different things or different words for the same thing. The word producer, for example, means something completely different in the film industry than the games industry, and quite often it's important to make sure that that is translated, and which is also why it's important to take part in the webinars and ask any questions that you might have. In terms of accessibility, depending on the resources that any organization has, you will be able to get definitely all of your queries answered, but sometimes you might be able to get support, especially if you need, for example, support with your application, depending on your accessibility needs. Beyond that, I also wanted to highlight something, and that is that according to the UK census, and I think that many of us in the room know this as well, the games industry is a very neurodiverse industry, more than many other sectors. So quite often, one thing that I find is when you're talking to folks in games, it's important to make sure that we encourage everybody to ask the questions that they might have, or even if they believe that they're not 100% eligible, because eligibility is another thing that we deal with on a daily basis, to ask what the eligibility criteria means, because you might find that you are actually eligible, or even if you're not eligible in this round, you might be eligible in the next round. So that's something where I just wanted to make a plea to ask the questions that you might have. Don't just read the brief info and then decide, oh, I'm not eligible, I'm not going to apply. We're all here to answer your queries, and beyond that, you might be able to feed something back that then allows us to iterate and change those eligibility criteria in the future. As Sarah mentioned, the video applications, I don't believe, were there from the beginning, so they were added based on feedback. Audio applications, potentially the same for Creative UK programs. I don't know if any of you have any interesting stories around people feeding into the structure itself.
In Northern Ireland, our volume of applications is probably a lot lower than what you guys would receive. So I have the opportunity where I can actually talk to applicants one-on-one fairly regularly. So in the round screen, the application process, like you apply, but if there's information missing or if we require further information, we'll follow up and ask. It isn't just a case of that's the application and that's it. So the main criteria for our funding is just, are you going to be in Belfast area and Enniskillen and Armagh? Like that's the main criteria, is are you based in Northern Ireland? When it comes to everything else, like it is a commercial fund, and so we need to see a good idea of what the game is and the team. But it isn't just a computer says no, it's a conversation and figuring out what everyone, the information we need to make a good argument towards the funding committee. But yeah, it's interesting to see the idea about video applications and audio applications, maybe that's something that we ourselves need to look at. But just due to the nature of Northern Ireland and the volume of applications, usually when you're applying, you're dealing with myself, and it's a back and forth conversation, which is probably helpful.
Cool.
Yeah, we do similar. So our programs and grants open at various points throughout the year, but whenever a big program or grant's opening, we have discovery call times where you can go onto our website and just book a call, a video call or telephone call with one of the team. So maybe you want help with an application, you're not too sure whether you're eligible or not, or which program's right for you. You can just book on a call with a member of the team and we can walk you through it step by step.
Yeah, for us, now we're sort of the other side of the pandemic. We are back out, getting involved in events, obviously, like everyone is. And I normally urge people to kind of try and grab us for a quick conversation when we're at those events. Although we do, our help inbox is watched very carefully, and we do reply to everything that comes into our help inbox in terms of queries associated with funding applications. In terms of having, longer term one-to-ones pre-advance for our prototype funding, that's something we don't tend to have, but mainly because the criteria are set out reasonably clearly, and the way of approaching it is reasonably clear, and we do try and give some limited feedback to applicants who get as far as the interview stage with us, and then don't get funded. But beyond that, we tend to just give generic feedback, which tends to really use the baseline for successful applications, and indicate that those applicants haven't met that baseline, and we invite people to then follow up with us once that kind of round is out of the way. It is just one of those things. It would be lovely to have a conversation with everyone, but when you have sort of 200 or so applications with a small team who are having to focus on getting the applications through the system that have been funded, it is quite challenging to do that.
And I think this is also the point where we need to remind ourselves something that gets me excited every day whenever I work with all of the lovely people in the games industry, is that we do have a thriving, very diverse and interesting games industry in the UK, and that is something that is being recognized both by central government and by the devolved administrations, by the different bodies that help and organizations that help the regions of England, as well as by companies and organizations like Film London, Games London. And this is why we see things like the video game tax relief being updated and increased by a relatively significant amount. And by the way, if you're making a game, you should apply for that, because it allows you to get additional funding essentially for your company. And that's also why we see things like the sector vision that was released recently, which allowed the games industry to get some additional funding. That's also why you're looking at the further integration of the screen sectors generally around the concept of storytelling. And I think we all recognize that games is something that is hugely exciting, and also something that is being integrated through the idea of interactivity, through the idea of narrative, into a lot of the other mediums. And that's really where we have to thank all of you for getting up every day and making the amazing stories and experiences that you're all contributing to. So really, I'm very happy to be in the room with you and with the panelists. And before we open for questions, I just wanted to ask you to share one tip that you think would be very useful for somebody looking to apply for your programs. From my end, I would say make sure that you read the eligibility criteria and the guidelines in advance, and read them closely.
I would say more on you're looking to apply into our fund, but some other funds I've sat on as well, it's usually where people fall down and is more on the production schedule, team plan, that side of things. People can put across really interesting, concise game design document, but remember a lot of those applications that we're looking at, production schedules, team, and that aspect, and sometimes that's left to the last second. So I would say, like, make sure that's well thought out and paid attention to as well.
Mine would be as detailed as possible, but be concise with it. So, for example, on a grant that we ran last year, we asked for a budget breakdown. So what would you spend the money on? And I find you get two very different types of people, very black and white. You either get my favorite type of people who put really detailed budget in. They make little screenshots of virtual shopping carts. If they want to work with consultants and experts, they'll contact them, ask what their day rate is. They'll come up with a little schedule of everything that they're going to spend the money on. And then you get the other end of the scale where they'll say, we want 25,000, 10K for staff costs, 15K for software. So tell us what you're going to spend the money on and be detailed. And it just shows to us that you've really thought about it and planned for what you're going to do with the money.
For me, I'd mention two things actually. And the first thing is we're not a pure kind of arts and creative and cultural funder of funding a game for a game's sake. We are, as has been said in the other conversations, related to a track that follows through to economic impact. And that's why our criteria will always be seeking that. So even a wonderfully innovative and creative project might fail in an application to us if it isn't showing something that's going to track through to some kind of economic impact. The other thing I just want to briefly mention, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole on it, but games with a purpose are something that are really challenging when they come to us. And people often talk about games with social good benefits and other impacts. And often they come to us in a kind of slightly strange way where there's a hypothesis from the applicant where they say, I'm going to build a game that does this great thing. And it comes to us with no sort of evidence that the hypothesis could, track through into impact. And they're pretty much impossible to fund if you can't show that there's some kind of efficacy, essentially. The times where we have funded something like that have been where there has been some kind of evidence base, perhaps, but it's really not our main field. I'd love to see the sector be able to do something where there was significant investment and alignment with research councils in terms of measuring efficacy alongside games content development. But that isn't the business that we're in at the moment.
No, those are all very good points. And before we move on to questions, and let's see if this switch works, I would like to remind you all that you will receive an email that shows you, that asks you to take a survey after that, where you give feedback on what you thought of the panel, the panelists. And if you would like to see more things like that, please do let the organizer, more things like this, please let the organizers know in the email that you will get after the session. I think it gets sent automatically as long as you were scanned in. So let's open to questions. Yes. I think.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. It was a really good one. Yeah, in terms of, maybe this is a question a little bit more for Paul, but in terms of checking like the economic impact that you can make in your prototype or your game, you usually need like some kind, well, of course, like market research and do a proper investigation. What are the kinds of sources of trust that you rely? For instance, if I give you information for Mewtwo or any other like kind of like report that I see that this game is actually doing really good at this time, how do you value that? What kind of sources do you believe in?
Always useful if there's supporting information like that. But when I talk about seeing some economic impact, what I really mean is that this is the beginning of a studio that's kind of going to grow in employment terms and has some reasonable chance of achieving revenues that will then enable it to grow. And it's very much that rather than simply some kind of commercial judgment about the game, because we're not really in a business of trying to pick winners in that sense and be swayed by some part of market intelligence versus another part. So it's about showing us and demonstrating to us that you're on that trajectory as a founder and in a founder mindset rather than a solo dev mindset.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at the assessments that we make with the International Business Development Fund, we are already, as I mentioned, we're already looking at supporting companies that have some track record. So we would like to understand how your previous game sales have gone. Sometimes you may not necessarily have that information because it's with a publisher, so it would be great if you can get it. We would like to understand what territories your game has sold well into, as well as, and then you can use that to base assumptions for your next game. And of course, on top of that, you can always add information from publicly accessible sources like news or other reports. And then we would be looking at your forecasting over the next 3 years in terms of, well, I believe that I'm going to release the game in year 2, for example, and then my publisher is going to recoup for 6 months, but then I am looking to get XYZ revenue as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually. Thank you.
I think we had a question around, at the back.
I'm well aware that my question is a very niche one, and it's mainly for Paul and Sarah. I am, well, on the hypothesis that I start up a studio, I am basically in an area which is a bit of a void. I am in the Northwest, and Preston specifically has a fledgling game dev and game audio program over at University of Central Lancashire, UCLan. But even the likes of UCLan do not know about this funding. Even the likes of UCLan, when approached in business expos such as Shout, have not given me anything about this funding when I have told them about my interest to start up in, well, game audio or potentially start up a studio. No info about this was given to me. The only source of funding that was available to me, which I was fortunate enough to get, was the de minimis funding, which UCLan knew about. So how do you plan to address this void? How do you plan to make yourselves more visible for anybody who's looking to potentially start this up in areas that don't know about it?
I mean, especially with creative enterprise. So we work in the English regions outside of London, and a huge part of our remit is to go out into those, as you say, like void areas. So we use our data from previous years and say, okay, there's not much going on in that part of the UK, that part of the UK, and we try to directly work with industry bodies in that area or put on events in that area. But yeah, if you've noticed that there's a particular void that we haven't reached yet, then please do let us know. And that's our remit, is to specifically find those voids in those areas.
Yeah, always good to know about those particular challenges. But I would say that if someone's looking to start up in games, their first stop may be some discussions locally with the university or whatever. But looking what's available on a UK context in terms of, and I'm talking about simply typing funding for games development UK into Google would show everything that all of us do up. So I do think there's a way of kind of accessing us that isn't dependent on just local contact, essentially.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
So maybe this is like partly associated with the lady's question over there. Is there like one central place where people can find out about basically all the pots of money to be had, which I think speaks partly to what you're asking, because the names of can change, and like people move on, and like you said, they change eligibility criteria, but departments at the government and change and get shifted around and the rest of it, and that could be pretty difficult for a lot of people to keep track of. And from the university point of view, and I'm a university lecturer, like we move institutions, and like it's very difficult for us to keep track of that and all the other things that we do. But if there was one central place where we could find this stuff, that would help massively. Is there? Could there be?
There is websites. I think there's one called Grantify. Whether all the grants in the UK are on there or not, but that's like a central database for grants and public funding. And that covers all industries, so you have to be quite specific. You go on there, put what you want the funding for, what region you're in, what industry you're working, and it will come up with a list of grants available to you. I can't guarantee that every single grant in the UK is on there, but I know all the main ones are.
I think UK's wiki as well is a really good source for anyone.
It's called Wikipedia. Anna. Yeah, so there's also, I don't know if he's in the room, but there's also a person called Colin McDonald who runs a newsletter called gamesopportunities.co, where they highlight opportunities that are available every month around things like showcasing, exhibiting awards and grants and funding, and not just from the UK, but also from outside of the UK, as long as people from the UK can apply. Beyond that, you can usually, we know about each other, so getting in touch with any of us might allow you, we might be able to highlight what else is available. And I believe that trade bodies like UK and Taiga are also going to be aware of most of the things that are happening. However, sometimes for hyper-local things, or quite often things that may not necessarily be super public, like for example, create centrals funding if you're based in an area that's covered by them, may not be immediately evident. So there, you will need to take an approach in which you're talking to industry bodies as well as your local environment. Quite often councils, for example, sometimes have funding. There is special academic funding that I personally don't know about. So it's going to depend about your area, your games. They might be able to find funding that's separate for serious games as opposed to for games for entertainment. You might be able to find funding that's different between games for children and games for people who are over 18. So it's all going to depend. And I think quite often it's going to be difficult to put together a mega database, especially as you mentioned, funds tend to change and change names and so on. And I think that's all the time that we had. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you for joining me. It's been great to be here with you.